Hi, Marco.
Hello there.
The first question of our conversation is what is a good musical composition for you?
A good musical composition. Well, I guess it depends on a lot of factors. And I guess that's pretty subjective as well. But I think personally, I'm more attracted to pieces that have some strong timbre dynamics and a sort of elaborate narrative. Then that can happen in a lot of different ways. But I would say these are the things that I'm personally more attracted to than saying what's good or bad. It's a whole different issue, I think.
Yes, and maybe you can tell some of the last piece, right, which you have heard. You just said there are these two components.
Pieces that I've heard.
Yes, last piece which you have heard has two. Because you mentioned two things, right? You mentioned narrative and you mentioned timbre, and yes, the last piece which you have heard and fits to those components.
Sorry, I didn't get the question right now. Yes. What do you mean?
So, right, you said that for you it's two important things was narrative, right? You prefer narrative, and then you prefer this, I understand, timbre, right? Or something like that. And the question is, which was the last piece, right? Which spoke to you, and has these two attributes.
So actual music that I've listened to.
Yes.
Oh right. That's a tough question. Well, I mean, without really thinking about genres, but just talking about music in general. And I listen to a lot of very different music. I think recently I've been mesmerized by this artist called Michael Manring, who is a bass player, arguably one of the most incredible bass player I know. I'm a bass player myself, so that's why I follow. I think his music, especially his last album, which is a solo bass album, but it's incredibly rich, both in narrative and timbre. Then stylistically, one can like it or not, because he comes from the kind of jazz fusion scene. It's a lot more innovative. It's just not repeating styles. But you can glimpse that influences here and there. But in terms of how, like the kind of sound that it managed to make his instrument play, it's pretty impressive. And also compositionally, at level of narrative, it's so rich. So like in 4 minutes of a song, you really get from A to B to C to D to A. Quite complex stuff that I like, but it's also very easy to listen to, despite being very complex.
Got it. And how would you describe your own music?
Well, that also depends on the kind of music. I do many different kinds of music. Well, I guess the music that most people knows for me is the music from the performances. And yeah, in that case, when I compose music for my performances, it's a lot different than performing music for the sake of music. And it's also different from performing music for a music concert. Because then obviously in a performance, you have also bodies on stage, you have other things happening, you have lights, darkness, space. So I would like to think that my music take all of those into consideration and supports all the elements while being supported by it. At the same time, I think maybe something that distinguishes my way of making music is also to add a certain cinematic dimensionality to it. Or at least that's what I heard, what I listened into it. And I try to pay a lot of attention to all the details that are making the music, and especially how they interact with the movement of a body, or the overall movement of a piece. So for me, it's important that the music exists there not only to support, but actually to add a direction to then the physical performance or whatever is happening on stage. And then, yeah, I mean, I also do music. I do bass music, dub-inspired bass music with a project called The Dub. And there I also bring some aspects of these, which I guess has to do mostly with an interest in cinematic sound, and also yeah, kind of sound and textures that allow your mind to roam free. This kind of music.
And what triggered you to start your own performances? What was the trigger?
Well, a lot of things, I guess. That was also a long time ago. Well, you know, I mean, I was a sound designer. That's the very first thing that I started doing. Yeah, like 20 years ago or something. And I think, well, probably one of the first triggers was curiosity to find alternative ways to create sounds. And then that slowly drove me to look into the body. And then from there, I discovered this whole universe of bioacoustic sounds produced by the body. And in order to use those sounds, then I created this biophysical musical instrument that is called Xsense. That was 10 years ago, and I still use it today in performances. And so this initially was merely amplifying sounds from the body, and then slowly became more and more complex, and then I started adding also machine learning algorithms to it, and then later more complex feature extraction and so on. So I guess there the encounter between sound design and quests for new sounds, like a lot of us do, and then the discovery that the body could be used as a musical instrument, and then from there, it all developed in many different ways.
Can you please elaborate the idea body as instrument?
Yeah. So, well, I mean, there are many ways of looking at it, and there are a lot of people talking about the body in this sense. For me, it is a way of understanding the body as an instrument that produces sounds as well. And so by using certain other instruments, like the biophysical sensor that I created and all the software that comes with it, you can literally create music with sounds amplified from your body as you move. So at a very basic level, that would be a starting point for thinking about the body as a musical instrument. But then I like to think also of the various configuration of feedback that happens between the body, sound, and other instruments, also in terms of vibration, for instance. vibrations in terms of somatics, how vibration of sounds influences somatic of the body, how all of those in turn can influence also the psychological approach to performing and listening to music. And so by extension, how that also communicates certain things rather than other to an audience. But then you can also think about the audience being affected by this sound body configuration in space. So it becomes a multi-layer ecological system of sound, vibration, and machines.
And you use a lot of sensors, right, in your works, in your performance. The sensors, right? As I understand, right? So you collect some.
Sorry, I have a problem here.
So you use various sensors or biosensors, right? Can you just explain what kind of sensors you are using and how they work?
Yeah, so the Xsense, which is my instrument, uses an electric microphone, electric condenser microphone, which just to understand is the kind of microphone that is used also in smartphones, but it's a different type of it. And it's this one, the one that I use in particular, it's mostly implemented in medical application for detecting tremors, or it's used a bit like an accelerometer in some application, medical application. And then it's also used for prosthetic control, exactly because you can place it on muscle, and by capturing the vibration of the muscle, then you get access to a lot of information about the muscular activity, which is what I do. But then I use an ad hoc set of features that are related to particular performance mechanism, and then I use those information to map various manipulation of the sound in real time through software. So that's one of the sensors that I use most. And then I use a lot of other stuff. It really depends on the application. Mostly also other biosensors, also electrodes capturing micro voltages from the body. I've used brain-computer interfaces before, although I was not so excited about it because it doesn't have much to do with movement, so it kind of felt awkward for me. That is certainly useful in other fields. And then you have the usual kind of things, magnetometer, accelerometers, and whatnot. Let's say I'm mostly interested in things that you can wear, because you can have access to different aspects of human movement, but also involuntary movement, and all sounds that arise also from just you living, basically. Yes. Breathing, heartbeat, blood flowing, and so on. So,
right, I said, do I correctly understand that you collect various information, right? From very small vibrations to movements to heart and etc. And from that you convert it into sound.
Yeah.
And could you imagine that your music could be possible, let's say, 40 years ago? Or it's sorry, I just I interrupt.
No, okay, yeah. I mean, to some extent, it was possible 40 years ago. Although I do not know musicians that were doing this kind of amplification of bodily sounds for musical performance back in the days. but for instance, the use of micro voltages from the bodies, so with electrodes, and the signal is called electromyogram, and also brain waves were used already 40 years ago. Of course, to a very different extent. There wasn't digital technology as we know it now. There were maybe the first analog interfaces for transforming signals from analog to digital a bit later than 40 years ago. But in general, there was indeed already an intuition or an interest in this kind of approaches to sound back 40 years ago. Yes, that's definitely, I think, what changed is that the technology became more accessible and more sophisticated, especially to the advances in medical and biomedical engineering.
And you combine this technology with performance, right, Sanders? And on what I saw, and is there some kind of, I don't know, you do your own choreography, or somebody helps you, or
Yeah, no, I do my own choreography. My choreography for solo performances, or also for other performers. I'm not trained as a choreographer, but yeah, as I said earlier, as soon as I started using my body to make sound, then as a matter of course, I had to start dealing with movement, sequences of movement, and so choreographing. But the way I choreograph is always through sound. I almost never make a choreography in silence. Like, I really have to compose movement and sound more or less at the same time, or at least in a feedback with each other. Otherwise, I can't do my work really.
Yes. But you have a movement, right? And this generates sound, but this generates some visual as well, right? Aspect.
Yeah, then there is also very often light involved, sometimes videos involved, in a way that they become part of the interactive system. Then yeah, I mean, I would say I mostly design systems that works through movement, sound, and light. That's what I do at a technical level.
Can you explain this statement?
Yeah, so okay, so let's say this: there are certain technologies that I use since 15 years, like my own Xsense instrument, but for each particular piece that I create, I try to conceive a specific system for interaction, and that's because first of all, I get bored easily, so I try always to challenge myself with things that I don't know. And secondly, I think designing a system specific to on one particular piece really allows you to dig into certain aesthetic aspects of what you're doing in a deeper way than you would if you were just using the same technologies all the time in the same way. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's probably easier to make some examples. Now, I don't know if people who's watching this will know my works, but I don't know, for instance, one of my best known works probably is called Corpus Nil, and it's kind of a duet between me and this instrument that I created, which is augmented with various machine learning algorithms. And so in this case, I'm using the same process of amplifying sounds from my body and so forth. But the system that I designed for this particular piece, which I did this with my colleague Baptiste Caramio, who worked at TUCAM. So this particular system was designed to create room for improvisation between me and this machine learning software through the sound coming from my body. Then from this core idea, all the setting on stage of the performance was also derived. And so the performance happens in a black box, and there is one particular type of LED lights that is used also to manifest the different patterns that are created by the AI in real time in connection with the music. So you get a whole synesthetic experience. It doesn't really have to do much with the concert situation. It's more obviously a performance, but it's really just this kind of weird audiovisual experience that you get, especially because then at the center of this, there is a body that goes through a particular choreography. Now, if people watching this will go and check on Google some images, they will understand immediately. Now I can explain. It's really just an amorphous piece of flesh that doesn't look too much human, but it keeps evolving through this movement, through these sounds, and the audience can experience this audiovisual sort of weird synesthesia that involves all of these factors. So to come back to your question, there is a core technology that I use. It's the same there, so capturing sounds from the body, but the whole interactive system, so to say, that I designed, it's really conceived to achieve a particular kind of aesthetic.
Mm. And when you are saying, right, to design a system, what practically it means, right? So you build hardware, or you build software, or you combine together, or what practically, right?
Yeah, you do all you just said. So most of the time I build my own hardware. I rarely use stuff off the shelf because they are not so interesting most of the time, at least for the kind of stuff that I do. And then I write software, mostly by myself, but often in collaboration with other people, because I'm a programmer, but there are programmers out there that are much better than me. And but then, yeah, connecting to what I was saying before, part of the system is also the aesthetic that one wants to achieve is, for me, part of the system. So the technical system has to be integral to the aesthetics, and vice versa. This for me has always been very useful as a concept to work with, because it allows you to avoid using technology just because you can. So in this sense, it's been very helpful for me thinking about it in this way.
And you mentioned a lot of technologies, right? What are the most, let's say, the most important technological artifacts that you are using? Right? It could be software or hardware.
Well, again, most important depends on which piece I'm working on. There are some pieces where something
okay, which okay, let's rephrase, right? Which are looking back on your own, let's say, on your own works and the process, which are technologies, right, softwares or hardware, which you have used the most?
Okay, yeah. Well, software-wise, certainly Pure Data. It's a patching software for graphic programming. Maybe most people will know Max MSP, so Pure Data was in the beginning what became Max MSP, but then they split. And Pure Data is the open source software, while Max is paid for. I've been using Pure Data for about 20 years now, and I find that incredibly exciting because it really allows to do anything. Then, of course, it has also its own limits. You cannot really build a user-friendly application that people can download and use. I mean, you can, but it's a bit complicated. But in terms of experimenting with sound making, and especially with interactivities among systems, that's one of my favorite things. And then, yeah, sensor, as I mentioned earlier, all kind of wearable body sensors. And then for many years, I've been working on robotics. So that's maybe not something that I used most of the time, but I've used very intensively for about 5 years. So robotic platforms, FPGA, computer boards, all kind of mechanics stuff, aluminum chassis and things like that. Yeah.
Got it. And what triggered you to start using machine learning algorithms?
I think it was originally, and I'm talking about 2012. Yeah, in 2012 when I used the some bits of machine learning for the first time for a piece called Ominous, and there, quite ingenuously, my interest was to find ways to create a system that could improvise together with me, because improvisation is really the core of what I do, whether I do it in a concert hall or in a theater or in a parking lot or whatever. So I think the first interest was really just about that, and also the use of machine learning started ages ago. So now there is all this AI hype, but especially in new music, just to understand each other, contemporary music, there is a long history of experimentation in machine learning. And so I think for a bunch of years, I was really interested in this kind of question. So how can a machine improvise in a meaningful way, especially in respect to movements of a performer or in respect to biophysical activities happening in the body of a performer. Then I think slowly I started becoming more and more interested in the cultural role of machine learning and AI, because around 5 or 6 years ago, there was the start of the hype that we are currently living in. Now I'm not gonna diverge completely from your question, but yeah, because of the growing of this hype and the mentality and the culture around AI and machine learning, then I became more interested in the cultural aspects of it and how you could use certain particular system and the way they work in terms of AI, to discard some stereotypes about it, to really dig inside the working methods of these types of algorithms and somehow manifest these working methods to the audience through sound and lights, or through the way how an algorithm can manage a stage in different ways. Yeah.
You previously said that you are designing musical systems, right? So can I say that you are like more like musical engineer?
Yeah, certainly there is. Yeah, you could say that of me. That is one part of what I do.
And which identity, let's say, if I'm saying musical engineer, composer, or performer, which prevails?
I think the performer prevails. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, I see myself as a performer that makes what it needs to perform. And I like that the word performer applies to the performer of music, but also performer of a dance theater piece or something else. So I like this connotation of the term performer. That's why I like to think that I'm mostly a performer. But then I'm a performer who is a musician.
Yes.
And I think nowadays many musicians are also at least a little bit engineers of the instruments. So.
And if you would live, right, you are living in Berlin. If you would live, let's say, in other place, in Serbia or in Egypt, would your music would be different? How being in Berlin shaped your music?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think context and situatedness is everything. I mean, I think my formative years were in the UK, actually.
In UK. And which was those years, by the way, right? You said your formative years.
So, okay, let's make it very short. I studied at the Academy of Fine Arts in Venice. Then I did a master in sound design in Edinburgh.
Yes.
At the College of Art. And then I did my PhD at Goldsmiths in London. And then just before finishing that, I moved to Berlin. So that's why I say the most formative years were in the UK, because that's actually where I that's where I created my instrument. That's where I developed my.
You mean in London, right? In this Goldsmith, right?
In Edinburgh and London. Sorry, well, hearing aid because I'm deaf and I have to change my battery now.
Okay.
Sorry. But yeah, I think in Edinburgh I really developed myself as an artist, I would say, like sharpening my focus and my interest. But being still very young. And then during the PhD in London at Goldsmiths, that's where I systematize my practice. Yeah. And coming back to your question, yeah, Berlin has influenced me a lot. But again, in a very different way, because I did not form my education here. So now I live here since 8 years, but I'm still learning how to be German. Not that I feel particularly German, I don't even feel particularly Italian. I mean, I just don't feel particularly from any country, just a citizen of the world. That's what I mostly feel. But definitely, I've been privileged in so many ways to develop myself, my education, and my artistic career in many ways. If I was living in Serbia or in Croatia, where until not long ago you couldn't go out of the country without a visa, that would have been completely different. I think something that I've been very lucky. Maybe the only thing that I've been very lucky in being born Italian is that I could travel anywhere without problem.
Okay, well.
That's maybe the only thing I'm proud of being Italian, and the rest is pretty much not nice. But yeah, I think traveling has been fundamental. So I imagine if you're born in other countries where you cannot travel much, I mean, you can do great things and be a great person as well, but you definitely gonna lack all the curiosities, all the friendship, all the ideas, and all the different cultural understanding of music, of performance, or technology. They are so different across cultures. So I think this was, at least for me, a very fundamental part of what I'm doing now.
Yes, and let's imagine for a very short time the same Marco, right, as you are now, but in a female body. Would your music would be different?
Certainly so, I would think. I would also say that I don't feel particularly male in general. Again, there are many different ways of thinking about it. There is, of course, again, the question of privilege, because as we know, Western societies are making a lot of advances in terms of gender and discrimination, but we are still not nearly at a decent point. So
yeah,
I can imagine, again, how much I'm more privileged because I'm being born in a male body. Then I guess also aesthetically things would be different, but I think also in my art there is I try to channel the femininity that is in my male body, which is not to say that I can do things like women. I absolutely cannot. And I think most of my favorite artists and writers are women, actually. So yeah, it would be different. I cannot really say how, but definitely so.
Right, when I ask you, as I correctly understand, when I ask you the question, right, about how you see yourself as a music engineer, a music composer, or music performer, you somehow highlighted two roles. You highlighted performer and you highlighted the engineer. And have your music been played by somebody else as well?
Yeah, a few times across the years, by other performers, especially some pieces for the accents. The one that are most easy to implement, because then I started doing stuff that are a bit too complicated for other performers. But yeah, like Music for Flesh and Ominous, which are the two gestural music pieces that I did about 10 years ago. Those have been performed by 2 or other 3 performers. And that was really cool. That was actually really cool. I never thought that would happen because it's such a idiosyncratic work. And also because I don't have that that formal background of a composer. So if you're trained as a composer, you work to create music that can be performed by others. And that's something that I really love about being a composer. But that's really the opposite side of where I come from. So I make music that I can perform.
Yes.
And that's why it's a lot so idiosyncratic, also because I'm an idiosyncratic person in general, and I like idiosyncratic stuff. So it was really great when somebody actually asked me to play these pieces. It was also very interesting for me as a non-trained composer to go through all the process of explaining the piece to the performer. I would say explaining rather than instructing. I don't really like that term. But yeah, explain how the piece works, but also how the instrument works, especially when you're working with my instrument, which has to do with your body and muscle tension. It becomes a lot interesting. And it's exciting because you can explain everything, but only to a certain extent, because the instrument then it's tied to your body, and the body of everyone is different. So there is no way that you can just play that particular moment of sound in the exact way I want it, because it's in the body.
Got it. And how your music changed during, let's say, last 10 years?
Well, a lot, I guess. Yeah, I think one of the main factor of change in the way I make music is the deafness. So I'm not completely deaf, but I have between almost, let's say, half of my spectrum is profound deafness, and the other half is it's just a little above profound. So I can hear things, but I cannot really distinguish sound. I cannot distinguish
Got it.
human speech, and also the condition is degenerative. So the doctors can't tell me whether I'm gonna be completely deaf at some point or whether the process will tableau at some point. But then, you know, even with very expensive hearing aid, you cannot really amplify beyond 6,000 or 7,000 hertz. So you can imagine, as a musician, it's crazy. Like there is so much part of sound that you cannot hear. And I'm into this process since 8 years or so, but I think it started before that. So in this time, I had to change the way I was making music because merely I cannot hear sounds. So there were certain sounds that I used in other pieces that I know they are there, but when I perform those pieces, I cannot hear them.
Yes.
So that, unfortunately, has been a forced way of changing also the way I think about sound. So I don't really much care about digging too much in a higher spectrum of sound these days. Although now in the next year or so, I think I'm gonna turn the whole problem upside down and start working a lot with those frequencies that I cannot hear, but that's maybe for another conversation. And then I think another factor may be that in the last 10 years, I expanded my repertoire from being exclusively a solo performer into working also with other performers, with a group of artists now, which I co-founded in 2019. It's called Fronte Vacuo. And by extension, also in the places that I started to play, because before, if really my early days of a career, I used to play in concert hall, festivals of contemporary music and whatnot. Then I started playing also first in galleries, then in theaters, and then in national theaters these days. So obviously the kind of music that you do for a piece changes also in respect to what the kind of audience, what kind of spaces you are playing. And of course, there is also a question of form as well. I always try to play around with those, so it's not that the music that I made for my theater pieces are like music for theater. Not that they're not really. They're always interactive, always improvised, and so on. But still, there are some forms that you have to handle in a way or another. If you make a piece that is 15 minutes for a conference on new musical expression, it's very different than making a 9-hour durational piece in a theater, obviously. So I think I learned a lot. How to bring my artistic and musical ideas to a point where they can be then ramified to different formats, and this allowed me to play also with these different formats in interesting ways. And of course, there is always something to learn.
It's very interesting when you talk about, let's say, disability, right? It's your disability to hear some sounds, right? What do you think by this factor of disability, how importantly it shaped you and your music?
Well, drastically. Now mine is also a particular case because technically I'm so-called late deafened, because this condition happened to me when I was already 30. Normally you are late deafened if you lose your hearing or part of it after 15 years old or something like that. Because obviously if you lose it earlier, you have a completely different experience of sound and how sound has a role in your life. Then for another thing that for me was surprising and interesting and depressing at the same time was that I started working with concept of disabilities before realizing my own condition. So before I mentioned, I worked with robotics for many years, and that work arose from my interest in prosthetics, in the idea of prosthetics, but also the technology of the prosthetics, and also the cultural value of bodies with prosthetics, how that relates to different ideas of how we reject people that are different from ourselves. Well, now without getting too deep in that, but I spent a lot of time studying critical disability studies, especially during my PhD. And then after having done this work, I was notified by my doctor that I had this condition. So somehow it was helpful because I already had some knowledge to handle theoretically this condition. On the other hand, you can have all the knowledge of the world, but still you are a musician who may become deaf, so you're pretty screwed. And that was, yeah, that made me spend a couple of terrifying years immediately after I discovered this. And then nothing. I just started getting more and more interested in this, because if you look at it from another perspective, being a musician who has a deafness condition, it's actually pretty exciting, because you know a lot about sound, and you know a lot about vibration, you know a lot about acoustics. So you have many tools to explore this condition rather than just submit to it passively.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so that's actually what I'm doing now, and I'm just starting a new project. I started last year a new project that looks at deafness. Well, now without getting into that, but yeah, that after 8 years, I managed to find a way where I could speak creatively of this condition in a way that I feel comfortable with.
Yes, and just it's very interesting for me, right? Let's say 10 years 10 years back, right, when you don't have this problem, or you didn't know about, let's say, this disability, and now when you have faced it, right, just how you perceive music drastically changed, right? I said. So you hear some sounds or some sounds which you didn't hear before, correct?
Yeah, I mean it's very complicated because, you know, on paper you know that you cannot hear from this to this frequency, but then listening at a perceptual level is very different from the diagram
Yes,
of your
yes.
frequency spectrum of hearing. So it's really complicated. I think something that I am more attuned to is this perceptual aspect of listening, and also how that ties into psychological and physiological states of the body. And which is something that I think people may feel also when they are non-disabled. But definitely I put a lot more attention into it. And it's always a pain when you listen to music that you love, because you're not hearing it as it actually is, and you know it, especially with the music you love. So that's always a pain. There's not much romanticizing about that. That just sucks. But you know, I keep discovering a lot of different ways of listening that not necessarily have to do also with vibration. Vibration is the most common ways of perceiving sounds for deaf and hard of hearing people, but it's not the only one. And I like to think also that, yeah, you're missing a certain spectrum. Maybe you're missing a lot of the spectrum like I do, but you're still listening to something, and somehow it's like you're zooming in onto something. I like to think about it in that way, rather than you're losing something, which of course you do, but you're also zooming into another part of the spectrum of that sound.
Got it.
So
Got it.
you hear resonances in a different ways, and to some extent, of course, again, I don't want to romanticize the whole thing, but I find it interesting.
And coming back, right? You said that you compose or you create works for different venues, for different events, and etc. What is your typical way of creating new piece, right? How you start, what kind of stages you go through, and how long it takes?
So again, I don't want to be a pain, but it depends. So if it is a solo piece, it normally doesn't take too long. But I'm also one that takes time to create. So I'm not one of those artists capable of making things very fast in general. But if it's a solo piece, it's a lot easier, because I have my instruments, and I generally start from a concept, an idea or a vision, and then work through to create the things that I need to bring that concept to life. So that can be technology, it can be sound, can be movement. Then if it's a piece for theater or a dance stage or whatever, where I'm working with others, then I guess it's a lot more an iterative process of feedback between me and the other people working on the piece. And it can take very long also, because maybe you need to finish first the dramaturgy in order to understand what kind of music you have to create for it. Or maybe you know already what kind of music you want to create for it, but you still need to have some samples, some ideas to try out in order to work on the dramaturgy. Or all these kind of different enmeshments of factors. But yeah, I mean, roughly speaking, I normally start from a concept, then develop what I need to manifest that concept, then rehearse it in private, rehearse it in public with a small audience, gather feedback, refine it or change things until something is ready. Then something is never ready for a premiere, if you ask me. In fact, I never understood why journalists always come to premieres, because a piece premiered, it's never really at its best, in my opinion. So there is always a lot of work after the premiere then to still refine the piece, especially if it's some piece that you want to tour and so on. And then so personally, once I finish the piece, I don't want to put my hands on it anymore. Even if there is something that I don't like, I just leave it there. And you know, there are some pieces that I've been performing for 10 years now, and of course I would do them differently. But I don't know. I think out of respect for the piece itself and for my past self, I just leave it as it is. And if I really want to do something or to fix something, I'll make another piece where I can do it better.
Got it. And just let's say all protest takes 100 hours, right? Just approximate, right? How much time you spend on creating, on thinking, right? How much on coding, or how much on hardware building? I don't know, combining different parts or cables or components together, and how much it still go through practice and improving and testing and etc. Where is this time, where it goes from your experience?
I think so. I would say most of the time goes into thinking and fixing and rehearsing. Like fixing and rehearsing is mostly the same thing for me. But most of the time goes in that, because then after you thought a lot about something and you noted down everything that you need, or the ideas or whatever, then you make. When you make, that's always the exciting part. So you just do things and play around and so on. But then especially when you work with technology, and especially in theater and large stage or large scale performances, then the technological system will always break down immediately as soon as you try it out. And so you spend a lot of time fixing things while rehearsing them.
Yes.
At least that's my case. Yeah.
And what is your, let's say, musician or composer fear, right? What do you fear the most?
That's a good question. Well, I guess my biggest fear would be to do something boring, something that I don't realize that it's boring. That's one of the main things. And then, well, another bigger fear is always the technical bug. It's always there waiting for you somewhere, and it's gonna crash in the worst moment, which actually very rarely happen in my career. If we want to count now 17 years of careers professionally, I think it happened twice. And once it was really scary because it happened during a large scale theater performance. And it was not, I thought it was a bug of my system, but it was actually something wrong with the electrical system of the theater that burned something. And all of a sudden the sound went boom. Silence.
Yeah.
That was quite scary. But yeah, I think really I think it's mostly when you are, I think I try to work hard against my own expectations, because sometimes, I mean, I think it's very easy to feel enamored of your own compositions, and that is dangerous, I think. I like to always detach a bit from the stuff that I do once they're done, and then come back to it with a fresh mind and say, oh, okay, this is good. No, this is not so good. Okay, let's redo it. Yeah.
Got it. And why do you still create music?
Just because I feel I have to. That's what I have to do, and I do it. I think I will just keep on doing it, and also for me, music is, for me as a person, music is fundamental. I cannot spend a second in my life without listening to music as well. I feel just it is what I have to do. And then, sometimes you also happen to discover artists that do something so good that makes you want to do something. And I like that feeling too. Mm.
And now some questions, not about you and your music, but about new or contemporary art music in general, right? How it changed during this century?
During
this century, yes.
the century?
Yes.
Oh, oof. Well, I mean, okay, it also depends what you consider contemporary music. So if we are talking about, in Germany they call it Neue Musik.
Yes, we are talking about Neue Musik.
Okay. If we're talking about Neue Musik, I find it quite interesting because, well, maybe not in the last century, but in the last maybe 40 years, there's been some very drastic changes also in the technologies that are available and how the technologies have prompt different ways of thinking about composition and playing music and so forth. But still, there is a very strict attention to form, I find, which can be good and bad. I'm not trying to make a judgment, but just as an observation, I often listen nowadays to pieces of music that are made with the most innovative technologies of software here and there, and then they still sounds like that kind of music from 40 years ago. Which, again, I'm not trying to make a judgment. I personally don't like that much this kind of approach, but I find it interesting that the issue of form is so drastically rooted that even when you have new compositional tools, you still want to contribute to that kind of historical form of music. So I find that interesting. Again, it's not my cup of tea, but and it's not that I'm saying that all Neue music is like that, not at all. I think that there is obviously a lot of music out there that it's very explorative in nature. And that's also what I like about Neue music. It's that kind of field that allows you to, if you want to experiment in all kind of wild ways. And then again, Neue music, it can be defined across different genres and style, depending on which countries you are in, I think. And I don't know if you think about it also, the issue of form that I mentioned just now, you can find it also in noise music. It's I don't think it's something that has to do with an academic background or something.
Yes.
It's really the interest in keeping on with a particular form of sound. And I always think about this quote from Anthony Braxton, that he used to say that there are always three types of composer or musicians. I don't remember. So there are the ones that dedicate their lives to pursue the form, and so keeping the tradition. There are the ones that dedicate their work to systematize the tradition, organize it, and so on. And then there are the ones who try to diverge from the tradition and try a new path. But the most important thing that he said is that the music and the arts always need the three of them.
Okay, got it.
Because the way they interact, the way these different kind of approaches interact with one another, then allows the fields to be rooted somewhere, have systematization of itself, but still moving forward. And you cannot move forward from something that you don't know deep enough.
Yes.
I always find this very inspiring.
And what are main trends? What are main future trends in this neue music?
Well, again, there is the mega hype of AI these days. So there are lots of new libraries and tools that use machine learning in many different ways. Well, a big new trends right now is generative sound synthesis with text to sound or image to sound, transformer generators, and so forth. So there is a lot of that going on. Not that I honestly happen to listen to anything too interesting in that field, but it's still very young. I just find that technically they work very well, but then aesthetically the sounds are always a bit of disappointing. And again, just for me. I think there is a lot now, apart from the technology. I think there is a lot more transdisciplinarity going on, or at least that's something that I note among my colleagues. So more and more people from diverse disciplines working together, be it dance, technology, theater, and noise music, and so forth. And I think that's very good because it allows a cross-pollination among disciplines, and that's something that I think is very urgent these days. I think somehow probably it also follows a cultural development of kind of mix up of things. That's also kind of a musical trend these days. And I think that is reflected also in disciplines. And I think that's very good. Yeah.
And how audience change during the century?
How
audience change?
Well, probably audiences changed more than the music. I don't know, it's a joke, but maybe. Yeah, that's very hard to say. I always strive to be in touch with young people, although that's not very easy to do for me. But I get internship, I go to events, try to get in stay with artists and people. And yeah, I mean, I can see, like, I can recognize some of my tastes and idea about tastes and experiences of sound also in the younger generation, but I also see at the same time how much they need something completely different than what I needed at the time when I had their age. That's one thing. Then another aspect that changed a lot, and fortunately so, is that audiences are a lot more receptive now to who makes the music. So there is a lot more recognition of all those artists from the past and from the present that had not been exposed to visibility just because they were women, or they were non-binary, or they were in a lower class. So I've been really enjoying the rediscovery of a lot of music, and also like to give what it was due to some pioneers also in the past, because I feel that music that was kind of closed in a shell by the white male Western typical owner of knowledge, now it's been opened up and is really influencing a lot music and music making across the whole field, not only music, but all kind of genre, even in pop. And independently from whether I like aesthetically something or not, I think it's very exciting that there is this whole wave of change coming in now, and that audiences are more receptive to that. I think that's really good. It's just good for everyone, like more difference.
Yes. And what is the role of new music in European societies?
That's a tough question.
Right, because classically, new music is financed by government grants, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
So the question is what it gives back, right?
yeah, no, it's interesting because now that you make me think about it, Neue Musik was born out of the avant-garde. That was the origin of it. It was called Neue Musik exactly because it was avant-garde work. And now it's not necessarily avant-garde. It can be avant-garde, but it does not have to be. And I'm thinking about it for the first time, really, because you asked me. So if the role of it before was really to break boundaries and experimenting with new ways, now that's not necessarily the role that it has. And it feels more like a tradition that is continuing just because it's important for Western culture that it continues for many different ways. Then if you ask me, I think all the techniques, compositional techniques, but also technological, machinic techniques that are used in Neue Musik could really be useful in other fields. Like that's what I try to do when I work in theater and dance and performing arts field. I bring all those kind of tools into this world. Then my audience at the theater, 80% of them, they will not understand the difference between the music that I do with interactive system and whatnot and a pre-recorded piece of music, but they would perceive the experience differently, even if they don't rationally understand, oh yeah, this is a sensor doing this and that, but the experience is different. And what happens then is that the audiences, I hope and I think, start familiarizing with different way of experiencing performing arts.
Yes.
Because I and other people like me, I'm not the only one, bring these tools and these new ideas in that field. So you're basically talking about how to say, well, disrupting a bit the conventional language of the performing arts and also creating a new artistic vocabulary for it.
And last question, what would be your free suggestions for younger composers, right, who just starting their own career?
Well, first of all, persevere. Be perseverant, always, constantly. If you really want to make a life out of this, out of your creation, you have to be the most perseverant person you know, because it's hard. It's a lot of competition and a lot of disappointment, but then the rewards will come and will be important. And yeah, maybe the other thing to be always curious about everything. Just do not discard something because you don't like it, but maybe just leave it be for a while and then come back to it. You never know. It's like a book, maybe you buy a book, you start reading, you don't really like it, and then after 5 years you find it, say, oh, this book, that's exactly what I need now. So I think this is something also I would suggest, like to keep being open, also in the long term. Like you never know what happens in life.
Thank you very much, Marco.
Thank you.